I come to you today with a little bit different perspective than some of my colleagues, and that's primarily because we work with both states and districts to turn around schools and systems. In the past 5 years, my team has worked with over 40 districts across several states in implementing corrective action plans and restructuring under No Child Left Behind. And from that, I'd like to share with you my perspectives in terms of what we've learned from the research as well as what we've learned from practice. I think it's fair to say across the board that the research on turnaround is sparse. And in my written testimony, I address for you some of the specifics regarding each of the models. But if you look across the board, my colleagues here have already mentioned there are absolutely key themes that matter, right? Strong leadership, absolutely critical. We all know you have to have it. A focus on instruction in the classroom, particularly literacy instruction, whether you're at the elementary or the high school level, it's absolutely critical. Solid learning environment for kids, a belief that all kids can learn and high expectation for all kids is critical for school turnaround and transformation. A supportive culture that engages families and that supports the non-academic needs of students. This is critical, and if you look at the research, you'll find that these non-academic factors in a student's life matter as much as the teacher and the leader in that school in terms of their overall performance. And lastly, something that my colleagues also touched on is the need for staff commitment to change. And that's something that's really hard to get through policy. So a couple things to think about with regard to this research. One is, we don't know to what effect or to what extent each of these different factors matters in different circumstances. So we know a leader is really important, but we don't know when a leader matters more or when an instructional model matters more or how these factor together. The other thing is, these are all really hard to implement, right? It's one thing to say, we've got to have strong leaders that know how to use data, as you mentioned, Chairman Miller, that know how to manage budgets, that can operate flexibly with autonomy. It's another thing to say, we have enough of these strong leaders so that they can go out to rural Illinois and lead a high school turnaround in that setting. So this implementation piece, which permeates throughout all of these sort of research and best practices, is really, really critical when we think about policy. And that gets to my next point, which is the policies that we create have to have the flexibility to allow for schools to gain this commitment, to allow for creativity and meeting the needs where we need them, while still honoring the core elements of what we know works in the research. So for example, several weeks ago, my staff were reviewing the school improvement grant applications for one state. And many of these schools were implementing the transformation model. And many of them indicated they would implement an after-school program because, as we know, extended learning is one of the requirements of the transformation model. However, what we didn't see in the applications was a focus on a coherent extended learning program that tied to the traditional day, that tied to the overall objectives of a school turnaround. And it's unfortunate, but what we've seen is when schools and districts are focused on compliance, when they know, hey, we've been sanctioned and we've been sanctioned before and we're being sanctioned again, the reaction is to come to compliance, right? Do what I need to do to fill out the plan to get somebody off my back. So how do we move from that to the real commitment to change that Mr. Silver talked about, right? He clearly said, all of our kids and our community, everybody here is engaged and committed. How do you get that? I think it's about, in some degrees, the flexibility, so focusing on the outcomes. While requiring an after-school program is a good thing, we really need to require that they have coherence and alignment in their programs across the board. And that's something we can think about. Now, what that also means is with that flexibility, we've got to offer support. So there's been a big focus, I think, on support in terms of implementation of turnaround and school improvement grants. There's been less of a focus in support up front in the needs assessment and planning process. Well, the reality is this is where the schools really need the help. As I said, many of these schools were asked to create restructuring plans under NCLB. And now, in some respects, we're asking them to do the same thing, only with a different name. So now create a plan for school turnaround. And if you get it approved, then we'll go ahead and bring in supports for you. Really, those supports need to be there earlier on to make sure that the right models are being put in place, that the needs are being assessed properly. And that leads to my last point, which is the entire system matters in this process. If we really want to make school turnaround a national movement, and I think that's really what this is about, that's where the momentum is going, it's got to be about not just the school as an island. The districts, in small urban districts, in rural districts, the district is the primary support for those schools. If a principal leaves, that district is the one that's got to come in and backfill and know what to do. States and regional support systems also provide support and tools for schools and districts, and we've got to be able to tool these folks up in the larger system. External service providers, early childhood providers, community organizations, youth organizations, we have to look at this alignment and coherence across the board in terms of the supports that we put in place. And so lastly, I want to leave you with one thought, which is I started off by saying the research on turnaround is sparse, and that's true. What we need to do is be very diligent about how we collect data and how we evaluate what's happening real time in the system. We need networks of organizations working together to establish what national benchmarks look like, to share best practices, and we need an aligned data collection system so that we're looking at what's working real time. We're not doing a 5-year study where we don't know the results until 5 years from now, but we're really collecting data now and making choices about what works by using the data so that we can replicate quickly. I believe we have a moral obligation to serve our kids. Thank you.